Hello and welcome to my world of stuff. Well, it's a drab, grey, miserable Wednesday afternoon in summer 2024. I can't think of anything better to do really than hide myself away in the cinema room and watch a bit of classic Doctor Who, so let's do that one thing. Hello, welcome back. Yes, it's time for another episode of Classic Doctor Who Revisited. I put up a video a couple of weeks ago, you may recall. Some of you may have watched it. It would be nice if some more of you would, but there we are, it's up to you. Brain of Mobius, I went back to 1976 and watched that classic Tom Baker serial from its second season. And I realised, looking back through my channel, that I described it as a new series of classic Doctor Who Revisited, something entirely new. Of course, I've done it before. I've done quite a few previous Doctor Who Revisited videos, but I think they were just random and spasmodic, whereas this is planned to be a series now which will keep us going until Doctor Who eventually returns, whether it's next autumn, next spring, wherever it's going to be, we still don't know. Because this channel seems to do fairly well out of Doctor Who content, but it isn't a Doctor Who channel. But I do like Doctor Who, and when there's something new to talk about, I will talk about it here. But to keep things ticking over, I thought I would do another Doctor Who Revisited today. And I did put out a little shout out for episodes and stories that you might want me to rewatch. I've had a couple of responses. One of them I'm putting on the back burner for various reasons. That will be coming up in the next 6 weeks or so, I think. But the one I am watching today is from season 12, Tom Baker again, his first season. It's Revenge of the Cybermen by, well, I should say by, because it was substantially rewritten, Gerry Davis. An interesting choice perhaps, because it's not one of the most lauded serials of this season. Tom Baker's first season, it's often regarded as a great run of Doctor Who, a classic run of Doctor Who. And of course it is, because it's the beginning of Tom Baker's long tenure in the role. It has producer Philip Hinchcliffe and his script editor Robert Holmes starting to refashion Doctor Who in a new image that they wanted to push the story into more mature territory, which they would do in the next two seasons. I think I went through this in the Brain of Mobius. This season was sort of a ragbag of ideas and stories that were sort of hanging round because they didn't really have time to get their master plan into action this soon. They had to get stories going, which is why you had stories like Robot, Tom Baker's introductory story, which is an interesting story because it very much straddles John Pertwee's era and the new Doctor. It's a very recognisable unit story, and I think that was very cleverly placed to ease the change from the third to the fourth Doctor. Then we had some slightly different stories, the classic arc in space, Genesis of the Daleks, Sontaran Experiment. Of course, they're the other way around in the running order. But it was a slightly different feel to that, even though two of them featured old monsters. The series finishes off then with Revenge of the Cybermen. It was the first time the Cybermen had been seen in Doctor Who since Invasion in 1968, so I think fans would have been quite excited at the thought of seeing the Cybermen again. This didn't quite give them what they might have hoped or what they might have expected. I haven't seen this story for quite some time. Obviously, as I always say with Doctor, I'm very familiar with the stories. I know them at the back of my hand. Yeah. So I don't feel that I often need to rewatch them. Sometimes it is nice just to go in and look with a fresh eye, and that's the whole point in this series, really. This is on the Blu-ray edition, which came out a few years ago. It's also got some new visual effects, so I'm going to be watching it with the new special effects. I don't think I've seen all them because I don't know that I've watched this since I bought the box set. So yeah, it's time to fire up the Blu-ray player to experience the revenge of the Cybermen. I have survived The Revenge of the Cybermen, the final serial from season 12 of classic Doctor Who. Before I start talking about the story, I want to put it into a bit of historical context, really, because it's, in its way, it's quite an important Doctor Who serial. When, back in the 80s, the BBC was starting to release VHS cassettes of Doctor Who and other output of theirs, Revenge of the Cybermen was the first Doctor Who serial to actually be released. Back in the mid-80s, I suppose it would have been. I seem to remember at the 20th anniversary Doctor Who celebration event, which was in Longleat in Wiltshire, Longleat House in Wiltshire, which I went to. It was an incredible weekend. You'll know the legendary stories of this massive celebratory event. We would call them a convention these days, that the BBC organised at Longleat, where they had their Doctor Who exhibition at the time, and where I think that it had been there about 10 years at that point. It's long gone now, unfortunately. BBC massively undersubscribed it. They underestimated how popular Doctor Who was, even in 1983. To think that 18 months or so later, they started their campaign to cancel it. It's quite bizarre. Anyway, I think 100,000 people turned up for this event, which was expected to have 25,000. It was a massive event, the first sort of public display of Doctor Who, apart from the costume exhibitions and so on. But at that event, I think the BBC were planning to release cassettes of Doctor Who, video cassettes, look them up if you don't know what they are, and that they had a list of titles that were possibilities that they would release. And Revenge of the Cybermen, I think it actually won the public vote, which is hard to imagine in a way. So, of course, a couple of years later, it actually appeared on VHS tape as the very first Doctor Who VHS. It was reissued sometime later in a budget edition, and then it came out on DVD and there's been a paperback. So it's actually been quite a exploited story in terms of its public availability. But I just mentioned that because it did strike me watching it that, yes, this was the first one that actually came out on VHS. And I sometimes like to throw in these personal recollections. I distinctly recall this being released at a price point of about $34.99, because those of us old enough to remember will recall that when films and TV programmes first became available, they were massively priced. They were like 40 quid. And it was only later that the idea of the sell-through market, where you'd release things at $10.99 or $9.99 for cassettes, that happened a couple of years later. So this first Doctor Who story came out on VHS back in the 80s. And I remember very clearly being in W.H. Smith's in Cardiff and holding this cassette and thinking, wow, there's 4 episodes of Doctor Who. I haven't seen these episodes in 8 years. I could buy this and go home and watch this story and it will be mine to keep. And I was umming and ahhing, you know. I was working at the time so I could afford it, but that was a lot of money for a tape. And I remember holding it and walking to the cash desk and then going back and thinking, should I, shouldn't I? It's a lot of money. I didn't in the end buy it then. I did buy it later on in VHS, of course. But I think I like that sort of nostalgia you get sometimes that is triggered when you watch something. And watching this today has triggered all those memories of the VHS releases and me thinking about buying it and so on, which is odd in a way because it's not a very good story. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It sort of deserves its reputation as the black sheep of the 12th season, I think. I mean, a lot of people aren't fond of Robot because it's bog standard pertwee stuff with a giant robot. I think what lets Revenge of the Cybermen down, of course, is that it's the first appearance of a classic Doctor Who monster in 7 years. And they're not covered in glory. They're covered in gold dust quite a lot, but they're not very well presented here. It's nice to see them because we haven't seen them for so long, but they seem a bit out of character. The whole title of the story, when you think about it, Revenge of the Cybermen. The Cybermen are machine creatures, as the Doctor sort of describes them, but they've eliminated emotions from their personalities. Remember that these are creatures that have replaced their decaying body parts with machine parts. So there's this sort of creature inside there, thinking creature. But they don't bother with emotion. So why would they want revenge? I know this has been pointed out before, but that's never going to stop me pointing things out on these videos. No matter how many times they've been mentioned, I'm still going to mention it. So the story itself follows on from this theme or arc that we had in this season, which was an arc of necessity, really, because the show was suffering budgetarily at the time. I think there was a recession and the budget really wasn't stretching very far. So the whole season was sort of built around, or a lot of the season was built around the arc in space. In the second serial, where the TARDIS crew landed on this space arc thousands of years in the future, the same sets were used in this story, which I think was filmed after Ark in Space. For budgetary reasons, they used the same sets, different story. It saved money, or it stretched the money a little bit further. Here, following the events of Genesis of the Daleks, where the Time Lords have sent the Doctor and his companions off to Skaro to either prevent the creation of the Daleks or to turn them into less aggressive creatures. They're now back on Nerva, where they started, but they've arrived at a different time period. They've arrived hundreds of years before the arc in space. The Doctor's not too worried because the TARDIS will sort of find them. It will drift through time until it finds them. They almost immediately discover that all's not well on Nerva when they open a bulkhead door and a dead body tumbles out, a body that's been dead a couple of years, according to Surgeon Lieutenant Harry Sullivan, played by the late, great Ian Marter, who is one of the Doctor's travelling companions at this point, temporarily, unfortunately, because he's a really good character and a good actor. And, of course, we've got Elizabeth Sladen still along as Sarah Jane Smith. The trio wander around the corridors. Unfortunately, there are some not very well disguised plastic mannequins representing human beings, cheaper, I suppose, at employing extras or supporting artists to lie on the floor. They discover that Nerva at this time is also one of a series of space beacons, particularly placed here to warn about the wandering planet of gold, Voga, which has drifted into our solar system. But when the Doctor and co get there, there's a skeleton crew left alive because a plague has ravaged through the station. But this has all been orchestrated by the Cybermen, who want to destroy the planet of gold because there's a long-standing antipathy between the Cybermen and the Vogans who live in this gold planet. These sort of scuttling little creatures with these very impressive sort of face masks. One of the plus points of the series, and I'll come back to that. Basically, the story then revolves around the Doctor and his companion trying to stop the Cybermen destroying Voga and trying to stop the Vogans, who have their own Sky Striker rocket missile, from destroying the satellite. And it sort of rattles on for 4 episodes. The Doctor and his companions travel down to the planet of Voga, which involves lots of quite atmospheric filming at Wookiee Hole Cave, and lots of sort of back and forth trying to stop each party destroying one another. In the middle of it, the Cybermen are a threat. I said at the beginning it's not a very good story. It isn't particularly accomplished when you think of what was to come in the next couple of Baker seasons. But it has its moments. It's a sort of a rattling, sort of quite imaginative space opera-ish story. But it does feel a bit simplistic, I suppose. I think there are some illogicalities in the plot, which I suppose is appropriate for a story about Cybermen and logic. The Cybermen are, we discover, allergic to gold. Gold sort of works against their breathing units. This is something that the series sort of ran with years later when the Cybermen reappeared in the 80s. On that basis, you think the Cybermen would keep well away from a gold planet, but they seem obsessed with it. I know they want to destroy it because there's so much gold there, which is dangerous to them. But you think they just sort of run away rather than go down to the planet and get involved with it. But it has its moments. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, it's location filming in Wookiee Hole, which looks very good. This is directed by Michael E. Bryant, who previously directed things like The Green Death. And in fact, there's a sort of a nod to that in the sequence where Sarah Jane is looking at a monitor on the space station, and a Cybermat, one of the Cybermen's deadly pets, they'd appeared back in the 60s. They're used here as vectors for the disease. They sort of bite their victims and infect them with this plague virus that they've created. And that whole sequence is actually reminiscent of the scene in Green Death from 1973, where Joe Grant is gazing into the middle distance and almost gets attacked by a giant maggot that creeps up on her. That's quite a nice sequence that's repeated here. What lets the thing down really is the story just feels a bit pedestrian, bearing in mind that we were still in that sort of honeymoon period from Pertwee moving over to Baker. I think probably Tom Baker needed a couple of better stories in this season. I don't think Sontaran Experiment is particularly distinguished. Robot is what it is. It's a season that's well regarded because of the 2 classics, Ark in Space and Genesis of the Daleks. And the season finishing on this slightly drab, flat Cyberman story. It lets the Cybermen down and it lets Tom Baker down. I mean, Tom Baker's actually very good in it. He has a few of those unpredictable Tom Baker moments where he does things that you don't expect. He goes off at a tangent for a moment, things he would do a lot more later on, of course. But because he's new, he feels new, and it gives us the story an energy it doesn't really have in other places. So it's a bit of a non-event in a way. I mean, it's nice to look at. It's quite well done. The Cybermen, the costumes are redesigns because I think they planned to use the costumes from Invasion in 1968, but I think they decayed quite a lot in storage. So they had to create new costumes. I think the Cybermen helmets look very similar to the Invasion helmets. And I like the guns that are embedded into their helmets. I think that's quite a nice little touch. There's a couple of nice action sequences down on the Wookiee Hole location with them fighting against the Vogans. But the Cybermen sort of lose something from the 60s. They seem a little bit camp. The cyber leader is constantly walking around with his hands on his hips. Christopher Robbie plays the cyber leader. He has a sort of a nice deep tone. But the Cybermen seem to lack that impact that they had in the 60s. And the fact it's quite clear there's only 4 costumes, the cyber leader and the 3 cyber lieutenants or whatever they are. And of course the story makes it look as if there's more, because 2 of them go down to the planet and you see 4 up on the spaceship. So you are conscious that there's only a few Cybermen in the story. Otherwise, there's some good supporting cast. I mean, you've got Ronald Lee Hunt, who a young audience at the time would have been very familiar with from his starring role as Colonel Buchan in the long-running ITV adventure series Freewheelers. Ronald Lee Hunt, of course, had appeared in The Seeds of Death back in 1969 with Patrick Troughton. You also had William Marlowe, who had appeared in The Mind of Evil with John Pertwee a few years earlier. And there was this little repertory company of actors like David Collins and Michael Wisher, who played Davros in the previous story. They play Vogons under layers of prosthetics, but the voices are quite distinctive. If you're familiar with their voices, you sort of know them. And in fact, Kevin Stoney plays Tyrone, who's one of the elders of the Vogons, and he'd appeared as Tobias Vaughan in the last Cyberman story in 1968. The Vogons are interesting. They're quite a nice design. And when you think that this was a fairly low-budget cash-strap thing, I think that's not necessarily reflected in the sets. I think the sets of the Vogan sets, the sort of chairman's room where the main Vogan action takes place, is quite a nice set. Fans will recognise the Seal of Rassilon that was created for this story, which then, of course, was adapted as the Seal of Rassilon in Deadly Assassin, and later on throughout the history of Doctor Who and the Time Lords appeared, you constantly had this Gallifreyan seal appearing. But the Vogons themselves are a bit of a bland bunch. You know, they're these creatures that live underground. It's hard to imagine a culture surviving in that situation. And I think all the actors who play the Vogons really throw themselves into this slightly cliched, run-around sort of space romp, which is, it doesn't have anything to say other than, oh, look, the Cybermen are back. And on that basis, it's enjoyable enough. I can understand why it has the reputation it has. It's not very memorable, I suppose. If you're not somebody who's watched it several times, you're going to think there's nothing much to this. But it's entertaining for what it is. The Blu-ray edition is interesting because I think it's the first time I've watched it on Blu-ray. There are some new special effects, some new CGI effects, because there's some slightly dodgy stuff in the original. That's been replaced by some new computer-animated CGI, which I suppose itself looks a bit dated now because those techniques have improved since this box set was released. Wow, when was this released? Back in 2019. The effects look good. There's some new effects of the beacon. There's new effects of the Cyberman spaceship. There's new rocket effects. The effects are glossier. It does improve the look of the story. It's just a shame the story itself is a bit of a nothing, I'm afraid, in a way. It's a disappointing way to bring the Cybermen back. Yeah, they deserve more than just being this bunch of disenfranchised robot men wandering around as the remnants of a dying race. I suppose it's an interesting concept that the Cybermen were on their uppers at this point and trying to rebuild their empire. But of course, the story doesn't really do much with that other than use it as a bit of background. So it's not unenjoyable. There's some decent action scenes. Tom Baker is very good. The cast are all good. They're all very game. They're all throwing themselves into it. But it's not a Doctor Who classic. I think most of us will agree on that. So, yeah, nice to watch it again. But I can only give Revenge of the Cybermen. In fact, this is a fairly decent score, I think. I'm giving Revenge of the Cybermen a 6 out of 10, which I think is not bad. Tell me what you think of Revenge of the Cybermen, if you have memories of it. And as I said, my memories of it are not exactly coloured, but influenced by certain things like the VHS thing, the fact that it was considered good enough to be the very first Doctor Who VHS publicly available story. I don't know what they were thinking at the time, but I think there's more nostalgia attached to this than any particular feeling of what a great story. I think it's one of those that evokes those memories of the 70s and 80s, and that's never a bad thing. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on this story, if you think it deserves its reputation, if you think it's a cyber classic, and any particular memories you have of watching it at the time, if you're old enough. Let me know what you think of the story, and if you've got any suggestions for future Doctor Who revisiteds, please list them down below, and I will get to them at some point. As I said, there are some previous ones back on the channel, including the Brain of Morbius I did about a fortnight ago, and some others back last year. So yeah, beyond all that, like and subscribe. If you've wandered into this channel because it was about Doctor Who and you like Doctor Who, why not like and subscribe? Because I do Doctor Who content quite a bit. And as I said, although this isn't exclusively a Doctor Who channel, I am conscious of the fact that people like watching Doctor Who content, whether it's modern Doctor Who or classic Doctor Who. So yeah, leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. I will see you all soon. Until I do, keep taking the cyber stuff.